What if I told you that there's a possibility you could be getting a $1,300 check in the mail, and it's not another stimulus package from Congress? What if I told you this money is already sitting in government coffers, just waiting for a Supreme Court decision that could send it directly to millions of Americans? Well, buckle up, because what I'm about to share with you could be the biggest financial bombshell of 2025, and hardly anyone is talking about it. Before we dive deep into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because updates on this situation are happening fast, and you don't want to miss out on information that could literally put money in your pocket. Now let's get into what could be the most unexpected windfall millions of Americans have ever seen. Here's the situation that's unfolding right before our eyes, and honestly, it sounds almost too good to be true. The Trump administration collected over $210 billion in tariffs during recent years, money that businesses across America have been paying on imported goods. But here's the kicker: multiple courts have now ruled that many of these tariffs were implemented illegally. And when the government collects money illegally, guess what happens next? They have to give it back. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so businesses get their money back. How does that help me? Well, this is where things get really interesting, and why legal experts are calling this situation unprecedented. See, when businesses pay tariffs, they don't just absorb those costs out of the goodness of their hearts. They pass those costs directly to consumers. That means you and me. Every time you bought something that was subject to these tariffs, you were essentially paying a hidden tax that may have been collected illegally. Think about it for a moment. Over the past few years, have you noticed prices going up on everything from electronics to clothing to household goods? A significant portion of those price increases came from tariffs that businesses had no choice but to pass along to customers. So if courts are saying these tariffs were illegal, doesn't it make sense that the people who ultimately paid for them should get their money back? The Department of Government Efficiency recently released some fascinating numbers that help put this in perspective. They calculated that $25 billion in government savings would equal about $1,300 per taxpayer. Now, we're talking about $210 billion in potentially refundable tariff revenue. That's more than 8 times larger than their calculation. Even if only a portion of that money makes it back to consumers, we could be looking at substantial payments to millions of Americans. But here's where this story gets even more complex, and frankly, more frustrating. The current system would likely refund this money directly to the businesses that paid the tariffs in the first place. Can you imagine companies like Apple, Microsoft, Walmart, and Costco getting massive refunds while everyday Americans who bore the real cost get absolutely nothing? That's exactly the scenario that has legal experts and consumer advocates up in arms. The question everyone's asking is this: how do you fairly distribute $210 billion when the people who technically paid it are giant corporations, but the people who really paid it are millions of American families who saw higher prices at the checkout counter? It's a puzzle that's never been solved before, because we've never had a situation quite like this. Now, you might be wondering what exactly these tariffs were and why courts are saying they were illegal. Without getting too deep into the legal weeds, the issue comes down to presidential authority. The courts have determined that the specific legal justifications used to implement these tariffs didn't actually give the president the authority to impose them. It's not about whether tariffs are good or bad policy, it's about whether they were implemented through the proper legal channels. The Supreme Court is expected to take up this case in their upcoming term, which begins next month. This is where things could go in several different directions, and honestly, each scenario has massive implications for millions of Americans. If the Supreme Court upholds the lower court's ruling, the government would be forced to stop collecting these tariffs immediately and figure out how to handle refunds. Here's where it gets tricky though. There are several ways this could play out, and not all of them are good news for regular Americans. The government could simply refund the money to the businesses that technically paid it, leaving consumers out in the cold. They could create some kind of administrative process where importers have to request refunds. Or, in the best-case scenario for consumers, they could recognize that the real burden of these tariffs fell on American families and create a system to get money back to the people who actually paid higher prices. But what if the Supreme Court decides to side with the Trump administration? What if they rule that these tariffs were legal after all? Well, then this whole conversation becomes moot, and that $210 billion stays in government coffers. The court could also choose not to hear the case at all, which would let the lower court's ruling stand. The timing of all this couldn't be more interesting. We're potentially just weeks away from the Federal Reserve lowering interest rates, which many economists believe could spark inflation. At the same time, we're looking at the possibility of massive refunds being distributed, which would also be inflationary. And if tariffs get rolled back, that could lower prices on imported goods but also reduce government revenue. Think about what this means for your personal finances. If you're one of millions of Americans who could potentially receive a $1,300 payment, or something close to it, what would you do with that money? For many families, that could cover a couple months of groceries, help with rent, or provide a much-needed emergency fund. For others, it might be an opportunity to pay down debt or invest in something meaningful. But here's something that's been bothering me about this entire situation. The people who probably spent the most on goods affected by these tariffs are likely middle and upper middle class Americans who could afford to keep buying imported goods even as prices went up. Meanwhile, lower income families probably cut back on their spending when prices increased. So should everyone get the same refund amount, or should it be based somehow on how much you actually spent on tariff goods? It's a fairness question that doesn't have an easy answer. The reality is that we're in uncharted territory here. There's no precedent for refunding this amount of money, and there's no clear mechanism for determining who should get what. The government could try to track actual purchases, but that would be virtually impossible. They could distribute money based on income levels, but that might not reflect who actually bore the cost of tariffs. They could give everyone the same amount, but that might not be fair either. What's really fascinating is how quiet this story has been in mainstream media. You'd think the possibility of $1,300 checks going out to millions of Americans would be front-page news everywhere, but it's barely getting coverage. Maybe that's because the legal situation is so complex, or maybe it's because no one wants to get people's hopes up about money they might never see. The business implications of this are staggering too. If companies suddenly get massive refunds, what do they do with that money? Do they lower prices for consumers? Do they distribute it to shareholders? Do they invest it back into their businesses? And if they do get refunds, does that create an unfair competitive advantage over companies that weren't subject to these particular tariffs? Here's what I think is most likely to happen, based on how government typically handles complex situations like this. If the Supreme Court rules against the tariffs, there will probably be a lengthy administrative process to determine refunds. Businesses will likely get some money back, but it won't be quick or easy. As for consumers, there might be some kind of broad-based payment system, but it probably won't be as simple as everyone getting $1,300. The inflationary concerns are real too. If hundreds of billions of dollars suddenly get distributed to businesses and consumers, that's a massive injection of money into the economy at a time when we're already dealing with inflation pressures. It could create a situation where people get money back but then watch prices go up on everything else. What's your take on this situation? Do you think consumers should get refunds for tariffs they ultimately paid through higher prices? How would you want to see this money distributed if the courts rule in favor of refunds? And honestly, do you even believe this will actually result in money going back to regular Americans? Or do you think it'll just be another case of businesses getting bailed out while consumers get left behind? The bottom line is this: we're potentially looking at the largest unplanned wealth redistribution in American history, all stemming from a legal technicality about presidential authority. Whether you see a penny of that money depends on decisions being made by 9 Supreme Court justices and whatever administrative process the government decides to implement. I'll be following this story closely and bringing you updates as soon as we know more. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on because this situation is developing rapidly, and the implications for your wallet could be huge. What do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll continue tracking this incredible story.